Welcome everybody to the Siyum. We're so excited to have you here. It's been a while since we got together to celebrate a Siyum, and it's very exciting to be celebrating Siyum Menachot together. Really, the Siyum of Menachot is an end of Zvachim and Menachot, so it's an even bigger accomplishment. I know this has been not such a simple Masechet, and neither was Zvachim, and we're at the last stretch, which is kind of exciting, but they are, I would say, the more challenging Masechet. So congratulations to all of you who are finishing, and we're going to get started. So our Siyum Menachot is sponsored by the Schuster family in loving memory of Randy Schuster's father, Dr. Elliot Shimoff, Eliyahu Chaim ben Harav Ephraim. He attended Daf Yomi for several years, and his shul congregation, Shomrei Emunah of Baltimore, made a Siyum Menachot for his Shoshim Seuda. It will be a great elevation of his neshama for him that his children, Danny Shimoff and Randy Schuster, now complete the very same Masechet in his honor. Very, very appropriate. Okay, we're going to get going with our program. So I will be starting as usual. We'll finish the Masechet together. We'll begin the beginning of Masechet Chulin, which I will leave you today a little bit confused, but that will leave you looking for more to listen to learn the first half of Chulin properly. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Alana Stein-Hain from Din and Daf, which hopefully many of you have already enjoyed her regular shiurim, and we've had her on different siyums before. She's going to give us the bird's eye view, the perspective. And then we're going to hear from Chana Chasson, one of our learners. So that is our program for tonight. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. Our daf starts off with, let's just go back a little bit. We were talking about the temple of Onias and Chonyo, right? So there were two opinions. Was it a house of worship for God, or was it a house of worship for idols? And if you remember, we ended with, we said that according to the second opinion, Rabbi Yehuda, that it was actually a house of worship for God. He brought a pasuk, okay, a pasuk that basically describes from Yeshayahu, that says, on that day, Bayomahu, Yeh Mizbeach L'Hashem B'toch Eretz Mitzrayim, there's going to be an altar for God in Egypt. Which sounds very strange, right? And then basically we're going to say that Mizbeach must have been in Chonyo's temple. But we then had to explain, what does Rabbi Meir do with that pasuk? Because it doesn't really make any sense according to him. There was no Mizbeach LaHashem in Egypt. So what was that? So at the end of the daf, we explained, at the previous daf, we said that Chizkiyahu, when battling Sancheiriv, after he beat Sancheiriv, there were different kings that had come, the sons of kings that had come because of the way Sancheiriv exiled the different people. And it says there, Bayomahu yu chamesh arim be'eretz Mitzrayim, midabrot sfat Canaan. They will be speaking the Canaanite language, which they mean is Hebrew. V'nishbo la'Hashem tzvaot, and they're going to be swearing to God. So what did they explain then? Where did those Bnei Melachim go? They went to Alexandria in Egypt, and they built the Mizbeach, and they offered sacrifices l'shem shamayim. And that must be what was the pasuk was referring to, and that's what they say, Shene'emal, now at the top of our daf, Bayomahu yeh mizbeach l'Hashem b'toch Eretz Mitzrayim. Okay, now there's a very interesting end to that pasuk. Okay, so it says there's going to be 5 cities in Egypt where the people are speaking the language of Canaan. They're swearing to God, and then it ends with a very weird thing, because here it sounds like these gentiles are worshiping God. Iyar ha'heres yamer la'echat. One of these cities is going to be called the Iyar of the city of Heres, of destruction. The pasuk basically described the Gentiles will be worshiping God, but one of those cities is going to be a city of destruction. So now the Gemara wants to know, my Iyar Heres yamer lechat. What are we talking about here? What city? So they say, Kedimitargim Rav Yosef. As Rav Yosef explained, Karta de Beit Shemesh de Atid lemichrav It Amar Dihi Chad Minhon. They say the city of Beit Shemesh. Now, don't be confused. This is not Beit Shemesh in Israel. We're talking about a city in Egypt. The city of Beit Shemesh, which, according to the Quran, it's in the eastern part of Cairo. Okay, actually, in the city of Cairo. It's the house of the sun. Why is it called the house of the sun? It's called the house of the sun because they worship the sun god in this place. And it's Atid L'Michrav. This is the Targum that Rav Yosef gave to the Pasuk. He explained it. Karta is city. The city of Beit Shemesh, which in the future will be destroyed, it Amar Dihichad Minhon. So it's kind of talking about what will happen in the future, that one of those cities is Beit Shemesh, again, not our Beit Shemesh, and it will be destroyed. Okay, now they want to know, Umimai De'ira Heres, Lishana Deshim Shehi. They're actually using this word in an interesting manner. well, this is doing a few interesting things. One is they're saying it has two meanings. One is heres, is destruction. But two, the Iyar heres is Iyar Hashemesh. And heres, they're going to explain like cheres, okay, which we're going to see, even though cheres often means earthenware, that's not what it means here. The cheres, first of all, just so you remember this, we've seen this many times, where the chet and the hey are interchanged for the purposes of drasha. So we've taken this hey of heres, and we've taken this word that means destruction, and we're now going to understand it in another manner, which is, it's going to mean cheres, which is going to mean sun, and that's how they got to the identification of this city as the city of sun. Haomer lacheres, how do we know this? Because it says in the pasuk, Haomer lacheres v'lo yizrach. It's pasuk in Iyar, which says we're going to talk to the sun, and it's not, it's like, we're going to say to the sun, and the sun will not rise. Okay, so there you have cheres is sun, because it's talking about yizrach, the sun will rise. So there you have it. Okay, that was a total aside, not really so critical. Now we're going to get to the much more interesting part of today's daf. So the first thing we're going to start with is difference, which is always interesting to us, especially because many of us are women, which is differences between males and females. Okay? Haviu banai merachok ubunotai miktzeh haaretz. Okay, why are we talking about this? Okay, what does this have to do with anything? Well, let's explain the pasuk. Okay, it's a pasuk from Yeshayahu, and it says that we're going to bring the sons from afar and the daughters from the corners of the earth. So there seems to be this difference of the banai merachot and the benotai miktzeh haaretz. First of all, it's a little bit strange. We're going to bring everybody back, males and females. Why are we separating them? Right? It's not like they came back separate. Right? They came back as men and women came back together. So what's this banai merachot and benotai miktzeh haaretz? Haviu banai merachot. So why are we here? What does this have to do with anything? We always want to try to figure out how we're jumping from one thing to another. Well, we're talking here about people who were not in the land of Israel. If we were talking about Bechonyo and a house of worship that was far from Israel, so there were times, obviously, when the Jewish people were not all in Israel, as today, right? But then, really, nobody was, and now that we're talking about bringing them back. Amar Rav Huna, elu galiyot shel Bavel, shedatan miyushevet alehen kibanim. This doesn't really mean, because it seems to be saying that the men are in one place and the women are in a different place. Now, obviously, men and women live together, so they weren't bringing men from one area and only women were living in another area. So they say it must be, this is an idea of something else. So, the Galut of Bavel. Now, if you remember, the Galut of Bavel was, first of all, they went to Babylonia early on. There was an earlier Bavel before they even finished destroying the whole, and kicked the Jews out of Israel. But anyway, the Babylonian Galut, which we'll talk about some differences, Da'atam yushevet alehen kibanim. Okay, this is a very interesting line. They're calm, like men are calm. Ubenotai miktzeh haaretz, you can see where this is going. Elu galiyot shel shar aratzot. This is the other lands. She'ein da'atam yushevet alehen kibanot. Okay, the people living in all the other lands other than Babylonia. Remember, we're in the Babylonian Talmud, right? So anyone living outside of Bavel, well, they're more worked up, something. We're not exactly sure how to define this. So I'm going to give you a few interpretations because it's very interesting. So first of all, I think what's more interesting is the Ben Yehoyada, who basically starts rejecting interpretations. And that's always interesting because it means people were interpreting this way. And he says, I'm going to show why you can't be interpreting this way. The first obvious interpretation is women are da'atan kalot, usually we say, right? We don't say this, but there are sources that talk about women, that they're da'atan kalot, that they're, again, exactly how to define it is a good question, but lightheaded. Usually we talk about it comes in the famous source of women should learn Torah because da'atan kalot, and they will misconstrue. And then men, they're much more knowledgeable, and it's comparing the Babylonians and the Jews in other places because they're not as capable. But he says that can't be because it wouldn't say da'atom yushevet. Da'atom yushevet means they're calm, okay, whereas the women are not calm. Okay, so he says it would say da'atom nosefet or something. I don't know if I would choose that word, but he says it would be they have more knowledge than the women who don't have a lot of knowledge, and then that would have made more sense. So then he says, maybe it means they're not worked up about things because they're calm, they have their life set for them. But he says, what do you mean? The men, okay, again, remember in those days, were all worried about parnasa. They had to worry about their livelihood. The women weren't really doing that, right? They were worrying about all the household stuff. The men were worrying about that, so you can't really say that they were not worked up about their livelihood. So then he brings this actually comes from another source, but he says, women, it's really the issue is that there's always something that women have to be worried about. And this a little bit gives us some insight when we think about the women in the time of the Talmud, about what their stress level was. And there was always stresses in their life. I mean, we all know that. We all live with stresses, men and women alike. So, but he says, and again, I'm not saying I'm convinced by this argument, but I did want to bring you his opinion because he brings kind of a few different ones and rejects them. So women, when they're young, they're worried about getting married. Now, you have to remember, besides that, people, you could say, are worried about getting married in general, but the women, if they weren't married, like at a certain point, their fathers were going to stop supporting them, and they were going to have absolutely no means of support. Once they get married, the fear is, are they going to be able to have children? Now, of course, the men also. So it's not a perfect answer. And then once they have children, they're worried that maybe their husbands will go find another woman. So these are the issues that the women in those days had to deal with, and that's a possible answer. Why they were, women are considered less calm, whereas the men, more worked up about things, whereas the men are more calm. Again, we can argue whether this is true or not, but that's what the Gemara says. So again, we're going to compare now. Okay, that was all interesting about men and women, but the real idea that we're trying to get at the difference between the Babylonians and the people living outside of, in all the other places in the world. Again, they're not really talking about Israel, they're talking about all the exiled places. And this is again just stressing, in Babylonia, that was where the center was. And by the way, I forgot to mention the other one, which is Rashi said, this is, Rashi points out that Bnei Bavel don't have I forgot to mention. So why are the Babylonians in a better position? So Rashi says because they don't have the Ol Malchut Kishar Galiyot Shar Aratzot. They lived a very good life there. They didn't have a difficult government that was limiting their rights. Things were very good in Babylonia. And that's why they are more Da'atom Yushevet Alav. They're calmer. Okay, that's another reason. The Maharsha actually says it's because they had greater Talmidei Chachamim. And because of that, and then there's an opinion that puts it together. Based on Pirkei Avot, okay, which it says, Nechunya ben Hakaneh in Pirkei Avot, chapter 3, Mishnah 5, Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakaneh says, Kol HaMakabel Alav Ol Torah, Ma'avirim Mimenu Ol Malchut, Ve'ol Derech Eretz. So if you keep the Torah, then, so here we have, because they were Talmidei Chachamim, they didn't have to worry. That was the reason why they were blessed, that the kingdom, they didn't have a rough a ruler on top of them. So those are all interesting ideas. Now we're going to move on. Amar Rabbi Abba, Bar Rav Yitzchak, Amar Rav Chisda. V'amar la Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Okay, it was either a statement of Rav Chisda or a statement of Rav. Mitzur ad kartikni, mikirim et Yisrael ve'et avihan shebashamayim. So just to remind you for a second, we just compared the Jews living in Babylonia and the Jews living outside of Babylonia. Now, in the exile, but outside Babylonia. Now we're going to start comparing Gentiles living in different places. And they're going to say that from Tzur, which is in Lebanon, until Kartigni, where it is, okay, this is Carthage, I think is the way to pronounce it, to translate it. It's actually very confusing because this place, Carthage, is by Tunis in North Africa. Okay, now the Gemara makes absolutely no sense according to this, and you'll see in a minute why. And it must be referring to some place that's all the way to the east and not to the west. Because Carthage, right, if you know the map, so there's Lebanon, and then to the west, across the Mediterranean, you're going to get to Tunis, so North Africa. But this seems to be describing a place completely in the east and not in the west. So it must be some other place. So he says, if you go from Tzur, now we're going to go east, because we're not going to go west like we might have thought, Tul Kartikini, Mikirim et Yisrael ve'et avihan shebashamayim. Okay, the Quran actually says it was like a trade route. Okay, even though the Quran says it was Carthage, and they don't really talk about the problem, I don't know why. But basically, we have that from Tzur to Kartigni, they understand, they recognize God. They recognize the Jewish people, and they recognize Avihan Shebashamayim, that they have a God. Umitzur klape ma'arav umikartigni klape mizrach, and here's why it's obvious that it can't be what we talked about before, because Tzur going west and Kartigni going east, they're basically mapping out the world and saying there's people who live from here to here, people east of Israel, which is actually kind of toward Babylonia, okay? But it sounds like they're saying between Israel and Babylonia, maybe because that's where the center of Judaism was, people knew who the Jews were, and they understood their God. If you go west, where there weren't really so many Jews in those days, right? They don't know the Israel and the Jewish people and their God. So now Rav Shimi Bar Chia goes over to Rav and says, wait, something doesn't work here. There's a pasuk that says, "Mimizrach shemesh va'ad mevo'ol gadol shmi bagoyim b'chol makom muktal mugash l'shmi u'minchat Torah." We're going to darshan this pasuk a lot. So he says, from the place where the sun rises unto the place where it sets, which basically means the entire world. Okay, God's name is great among the goyim, among the nations. U'b'kol makom, and everywhere, muktar mugash l'shmi u'minchat Torah. So basically, people are sacrificing sacrifices. Amarle, shimiat. Wait, so basically what Shimi is saying is, Rav, how can you possibly say that some of the world recognize God, some of the world doesn't? All these people recognize God according to this pasuk, right? They're not, again, this, we always like to say this, which is they use psukim to prove things rather than historical evidence, right? The pasuk says that it must be true. So now he says, Amar Shimiat, is your name really Shimi? Like, do you really know what you're talking about? Okay, or there's different ways of interpreting that Shimiat. But some people say he was looking down. And that, right, Rashi brings two interpretations. He was looking down, he couldn't see. He says, is that Shimi speaking? Dekarle Aloha de Elah. They call our God the God of gods, but they don't really believe in God. Okay, so this has many interpretations. One is they say that God maybe created the world, but then kind of left, or doesn't really have what we call hashgacha pratit. God isn't watching over the world anymore, okay? Or different interpretations, but it basically means they don't really believe in God. Like, they recognize there's a God, but they kind of put that aside, that they don't really believe in God, and that's how you resolve the problem. Okay. Now so what we did so far, really, if you think about it, is we talked about comparisons between different Jews living in different places, and then different Gentiles, okay? Perhaps difference between Gentiles living in different places, right, as the first statement said. Now we're going to have 5 statements about the importance of, ready for this? Talmud Torah, okay? They always like to end Masechta with the importance of Talmud Torah. So here goes. B'chol makom, and why are we starting here? Because of the pasuk. B'chol makom muktar mugash l'shmi. Now, there's a problem with this pasuk. First of all, the pasuk is talking about Gentiles, and we're going to darshan it about Jews. That's number 1. But number 2, what's the problem? If you say it's talking about Jews, well, we know that lo b'chol makom, you can't sacrifice things to God anywhere, okay? Only in the Beit HaMikdash. So b'chol makom salkadatach, it can't possibly mean everywhere. So Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Elu talmidei chachamim ha'uskim b'Torah b'chol makom. These are Torah scholars that are uskim b'Torah everywhere in the world. They're learning Torah anywhere. Ma'aleh ani alehem ki ilu maktirinu megishim l'shmi. Okay, God says, I'm going to look at this as if they're sacrificing sacrifices to me. Uminchat Torah, the very end of that pasuk, zeh halomeh Torah b'tahara. This is a different thing. If you learn Torah b'tahara, that's the idea. What does that mean? Nosei isha v'achar kach lomeh Torah. First get married and then start learning, because otherwise you're going to be distracted in your learning with, who am I going to marry, or perhaps bad thoughts about women, the issues that young people deal with, and we want to get you focused on your learning. So get married, get to that stage, and then you can learn. Okay, there's a whole debate always about that, which is the better way to go on that. But anyway, the main point for us is the first statement. Talmidei Chachamim, it's as if they actually brought sacrifices in the temple. Now you have to remember they're living post-destruction, and they want to figure out, right, where do we fit in now? We don't have sacrifices anymore. So now they're saying that this kind of replaces sacrifices. And if you did this, it's as if you brought the sacrifices. Okay, second statement. Shir Hamalo. Now we're to a pasuk in Tehillim. Hine berchu et Hashem kol avdei Hashem, homdim bebeit Hashem balelot. Okay, they bless God, all the worshipers of God who stand in the house of God at night. Now we've learned Tzvachim, we've learned Menachot. What do we know? They don't sacrifice at night. Okay, so my balelot. Why are they talking about the night? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Elu talmidei chachamim ha'oskim b'Torah b'layla. These are Torah scholars learning at night. Ma'aleh. So why is it talking about they're worshiping God as if they're doing sacrifices? Ma'aleh alehem ha'katuv ki'ilu asukim b'avodah. They say, it's going to be as if, same idea, as if they brought sacrifices. Third pasuk. La'olam, this is in Divrei Hayamim, and it's about Shlomo HaMelech. Okay, when he builds the Beit HaMikdash, it says, La'olam zot al Yisrael. Forever this will be for the Jewish people. The temple. Okay, we know the temple wasn't forever. Okay, the temple didn't last forever. So what does that mean? Amar Rav Gidol, Amar Rav, Mizbeach banoi u'Michael sar hagadol omed u'makriv alav korban. Basically, there's in the heavens, there's a Beit HaMikdash, and even though we don't have a Beit HaMikdash down here, there's one in the heavens, and Michael is bringing sacrifices every day. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Elu Talmidei Chachamim ha'asukim behilchot avodah. This is not that there's something up in the heavens. This is the people who are sitting learning Torah in this world. Ma'aleh alehem ha'katuv ke'ilu nivneh mikdash bimehem. Okay? I'm making it for them as if, this is different, not as if they worship, but as if the mikdash was built in their days. Okay, I just want to point out a really interesting Tosfot here, okay? Tosfot says on the Michael Sar Gadol, he says that this will change your davening every day. Every day in davening we say Ritzei. What does it say in Ritzei in the davening? Ritzei Hashem Elokecha b'amcha Yisrael u'b'tfilatam. God should accept our tefillot. V'hashev et ha'avodah lidbir beitecha. And bring the avodah back to our house of dwelling. Ve'ishei Yisrael u'tfilatam ba'avat kabel b'ratzon. Okay, now, this Ishei Yisrael is very hard to read this because Ishei Yisrael could go both ways, and this is what Tosfot points out. If you go by the opinion that Michael is up there giving korbanot, then you read it like this, right? Bring the avodah back, and in the meantime, Ishei Yisrael u'tfilatam ba'avat kabel b'ratzon. Right now, accept the Ishei Yisrael, which is what Michael, the Sar in the heavens, accept the korbanot that he's bringing, and accept the tefillot, which is what the people are doing. If you say that, no, that's not what we're talking about, what you want to read is like this. Hashev et avodah livir beitecha ve'ishei Yisrael. Bring back the avodah and the korbanot, right? Ishei is from fire, right? The things of the fire of the Jewish people, which means they're sacrifices. And then, comma, u'tfilatam ba'avat kabel b'ratzon, and in the meantime, accept their prayers. So you see that we have these two different ways of reading that. And that Tosfot points out here on the daf. Okay, let's move on. Amarish Lakish. My dechtiv zot haTorah la'olam lemincha lechatat u'la'asham. Okay, why does it say in the pasuk? These are the rules for the Torah, right? This is the end of Vayikra chapter 7 after we finish the whole list of korbanot that we're more familiar with than we were before we started learning the daf here. But it says this is the Torah, okay, for the Ola the Mincha. Now, zot haTorah in the Torah means these are the rules. But it's talking about Torah, the word Torah. So what do they say? So it says, for the Ola, the Mincha, the Chatat, and the Asham. Kol osek b'Torah, ki'ilu akriv Ola, Mincha, Chatat, v'Asham. Okay? It's like we said before, it's as if you brought sacrifices. Amar Rava, he says, what do you mean? That's not the way to read this pasuk. Hai le'ola le'mincha. It says, for the Ola, for the Chatat. Ola u'mincha mebaile. If you were right, it shouldn't have the word le'ola, le'chatat. It should just say, this is the Torah. The Torah is mincha ola chata. It's as if, right, as if you brought those sacrifices. So according to you, the lamed doesn't belong. Ella amarava. Now here's the very small nuance, but it's very important. Kol haosek b'Torah eino tzarich lo ola v'lo chata v'lo mincha v'lo asham. If you learn Torah, you don't need all those other things. Now, why is this significantly different? This is not saying if you do this, then you won't need, right? What is this basically saying? This is saying that this isn't replacing like, okay, if you do this, it's as if. We'll make it as if, we'll give you a checkbox for doing sacrifices. This is saying you don't need the other stuff. Sacrifices are not the ideal, right? What's the ideal? Torah learning is the ideal. It's not the sacrifices. It's the Torah learning that's ideal. And there's a very small nuance here, but it's a very big difference, because does it mean that we wish we had sacrifices? And this I know a lot of people struggled with in the Masechet. Do we really want sacrifices? Right? According to the first opinions, it sounded like we wish we had sacrifices. We don't. We're going to replace it with something else. And God will view it as if we did the sacrifices. But this is saying, no, you don't need sacrifices if you have learning Torah. Learning Torah is the way to get to sacrifices get to the same goal. Now, what's the goal, right? If you think about korban, what's korban? Kirva, coming close to God, right? That you can achieve in many other ways. You can achieve it through Talmud Torah, right? If we know also in the beginning of brachot, tefillah keneged korban, right? The tefillah keneged korbanot tiknu. You could get there through prayer. You could get there through chesed. There's so many other avenues to get to close to God, right? The Rambam talks about, learning Torah is getting to know God. That's the whole idea. It's to bring you closer to God. And the Korban does that also, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the ideal way to do it. There's many other ways to do it, and one could definitely claim that learning Torah is perhaps more ideal than sacrifices. Which brings us back to the question we talked about in the beginning, right? Sacrifice is ideal, or was that what was going on at the time, and God gave us a way to kind of, this is the way I want you to do it as Jews. Anyway, there's a lot more there, but we're going to move on. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, my dechtiv zot Torah chatat v'zot Torah hasham. Now, besides it says that one pasuk where chatat and hasham are mentioned. It also says it specifically by, these are the rules for the chatat. You might remember this. Zot chatat hasham. Kol osek b'torat chatat ki'ilu ikriv chatat. V'kol osek b'torat hasham ki'ilu ikriv hasham. Another minor difference. What is this one saying? This one's saying that if you learn Torah specifically about the chatat, this is what we call the promo for Zvachim and Menachot. You would have thought they put this at the very beginning and not at the end. But if you learn chatat, it's as if you did the chatat. If you learn the asham, it's as if you brought the asham. Okay, it provides you with the same atonement if you learn it. Okay, the Chavetz Chaim was very into this Gemara, and he said, based on this, like we should be learning Kodshim in all the Batei Midrash, and he made a big thing of it to get people to learn Kodshim, because he says it's like you're doing the Korbanot if you actually learn about them. So that's another idea. Okay, with that, we're moving on to our next Mishnah. Ne'emar ba'olat behema isher re'ach nichach, u'ba'olat of isher re'ach nichach, u'b'mincha isher re'ach nichach. The Mishnah points out to us that the same language is used, that the the fire, is a pleasing aroma to God, whether it's an animal, whether it's a bird, whether it's a mincha. Lomar lecha, the Mishnah says, a very beautiful way that the Masechet of Mishnah ends right here. We have a little more Gemara to do on this. Doesn't matter if you bring the biggest animal, the cheapest mincha, it doesn't matter. What's important? That you want to worship God, that you have the right intentions, which brings us back to the very beginning of the beginning of Zvachim and the beginning of Menachot, all about your intentions and how important that is. Amar Rabbi Zera Maikra. So Rabbi Zera says, what's the proof for this? Mitzuka shnat ha'oved. Shnat doesn't mean the year, it means the sleep of. The sleep of those who worship is sweet. They sleep well. Okay, for those who are struggling to sleep, maybe if we had korbanot, we'd sleep better. Im ma'at ve'im harbe yochal. Whether you eat a lot, whether you eat a little, meaning whether you bring a big sacrifice, whether you bring a small sacrifice. Rav Ada bar Ava amar mehacha. But he brings a different pasuk. Birbota tova revuach leha. You can bring a lot of sacrifices, and you'll have a lot of people eating it, meaning you'll give it to a lot of kohanim, because kohanim mostly eat the meat. Uma kisharon leba'alav, they don't quote the important part of the pasuk, ki imra'ot einav. But what they mean by kisharon is, what is the advantage for the owner being God? What's the advantage? Ki imra'ot einav, what God sees. Meaning, what does God see? Our intentions. That's all that matters. It doesn't matter how much you bring, how much food the kohanim are eating from your sacrifices. And here's a bright in that same idea. Tanya, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, Bo re'eh maktiv b'parshat korbanot shelo ne'amar behen lo el v'lo Elohim ela Hashem. The word El and Elohim is not mentioned, only the word Hashem. Shelo litem pitchom peh leba'al din lachlok. So we don't open this to say, this very interesting line, that each korban is for a different God. Right? We talked about all the time, what's the difference between all these korbanot? Doesn't say El or Elohim because people say, oh, gods. There must be many gods, and that's why there's all these sacrifices. Each one is to a different God. This brighta now, this is why we brought the brighta, because it says the same thing as the Mishnah. It says by the big, large ox, Ishareach Nichach, Ube'of Hadak, and by the little teeny bird, the little thin bird, it says Ishareach Nichach, Ube'mincha Ishareach Nichach, Lomar Lecha Chadam Arbeh V'Chadam Am'it Ubevad Shecha Ben Libo L'Shamayim. Now, here comes another big line. V'Shema Tomar La'achi La'u Tzarik. You really wish they had talked about this in the beginning. Does God need the food? Are we giving God the food? Is that what it's for? For God? Talmud Lamal, Imer Av Lo Amar Lach, Ki Li Tevel Umloah. If I was hungry, I wouldn't tell you, God says, because I have everything. The whole world is mine. I don't need your food. V'ne'amar Ki Li Kol Chayato Yar. All the animals are mine. Behemot B'harei Elef. Okay, the thousands that are in the mountains, they're all mine. Yadati Kol Of Harim V'ziv Sadai Madi. I know all the birds that are flying in the mountains, and that I know, and that are in the fields. You think I eat the meat of the bulls that you're offering me? You think there's a rhetorical question. And the blood from the goats I'm going to drink? Thank you, but no thank you. That's not for me. Lo amarti alechem zivchu kadesh tomao. Right? Why did I tell you to do this? So that you would say, I will do what God asks of me, and then God will do what I ask of him. Lo lirtzoni atem zovchim, ela lirtzomchem atem zovchim. You're doing it for yourselves. This is for you, not for God. Shenemal, lirtzomchem tizbechuhu. Okay, I want you to pay attention. In this week's parsha, it's going to say, lirtzomchem tizbechu. There's two psukim, there's different girsa'ot here. Which one is the one? Is it from Yud Tep from last week, or is it from Kaf Bet this week? Okay, one is about the Shlamim, one is about the Todah. Davar acher, it's a different rasha. Lirtzomchem tizbechu, lirtzomchem zivchu, lidatchem zivchu. Also according to your desires, and also like for your own sake, and also lidatchem with intentionality. Okay, like we've discussed a lot. Kedeban minei shmomei, Rav Huna, as he asked, minayin lemitasek bekodashim shu pasul. What if accidentally you slaughter an animal without intending? Okay, like you throw a knife and the knife kills the animal exactly in a perfect shlita way. How that would happen, you'll see already from the beginning of Chulin. It's quite kind of impossible for that to happen. But if you didn't intend to do the act and it happened anyway, how do you know that that's completely disqualified? Shneimar v'shachatet ben habakal shetei shchita l'shem ben bakal. Because it says a ben habakar, it means it has to be for the intent of the ben bakar. Amarlo. Zobi adenuhu la'akev minayin. He says, that's not what I was asking you. Of course I know that, right? That was all about the first Mishnah and all that and Lishma. He says, I know that, but how do you know that it's ma'akev, that you, remember we talked a lot about ma'akev, that if you don't do that, it's completely ruined. Not that you should do that, but what if you don't have the right intention at all? How do we know it's completely disqualified? Talmud lomar, lirtzomchem tizbechu, lidatem zivchu. Okay, this is either because it says v'shachad ben bakar and lirtzomchem, or perhaps it's the two psukim I just talked about. When something repeats itself, it means it's essential. And it ends with this idea, where we started, how essential your intent is in sacrifices. And with that, Hadran ala charei ala isaron, uslik ala mesechet menachot. So I want to do a really quick summary of the daf, and then just add one more point, and then we're going to move on. So we started by differentiating between different types of people. We moved on to Torah study fills the place of sacrifices. From there, we got to equality in worship of God, of everyone being the same, and really the idea of the intention is what's important, and the purpose of sacrifices. That what are they for? They're for God. They're not for God. They're for us. Okay. And what I wanted to just end with, which I really talked about already, but I thought to leave you with this idea about the end, how Talmud Torah takes the place of sacrifices, and we have this debate whether it's actually just well, we don't have it, so we're going to do this, and b'diavad. Or perhaps it's actually lechatchila. And I think the idea that the daf started with different types of people and comparing them, I think that's really the idea here. And often we have at the end of Masechtot where maybe there's rules and there's a lot of principles, but in the end, the Masechtot often, and I've talked about this in many, many siyums, they end with this gray area. And in this case, I wouldn't even call it gray. I would say it's a multicolored area where everybody has a different way of doing it, and it depends on where you live. It depends on what time period you're living in, how you're going to worship God. It depends on what your nature is, right? There's so many ways to get to this korban, this kirva, this closeness to God, and everyone should find their way within that, and that is the message, I think, of this Masechet.